Thank you so much for being here. Welcome back. Thank you, Rabbi Helfgot. Welcome back to actually the final week of the Bava Batra unit of our Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah in-depth program with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot. Thanks again for being here and looking forward to learning. Thank you, Rabbi Helfgot.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chaya. And thank you for all the weeks you've been doing it. When Chaya puts the material, it's already on the material, it's already there. Okay, so I wanted to just start with a, let me share my screen. I wanted to start with just a generic comment that, Masechet Bava Batra, in general, not just the Mishnah, but the mishnayot in general, the Gemara is the longest Masechet, one of the longest, I think it is the longest Masechet in Shas, 176 dapim, for all kinds of reasons. But for our purposes, what's interesting is that of those 176 dapim, 70 of them take up chapter 8, 9, and 10, the chapters that we are looking at tonight. We started chapter 8 last week. I just wanted to make a more broad point about chapter 8 and then do a couple of other things in chapter 8 and then focus on chapter 9 and just say something quickly about chapter 10, a couple of quick notes about chapter 10. But to me, it's striking that 70%, and I did the math, it's 70 dapim is 40%, exactly. 40% of the material in Masechet Bava Batra is from these three prakim, which is fascinating, and tells you how complicated some of the inyanim, some of the topics are in these three prakim. I think it's also important to note that while the first six prakim, the idea of hakol keminhag hamedina plays a very central role in when you sell something, when you buy something, at what point is it defined as having been sold, not having been sold, what's included, what's not included. That plays a major role. In these three prakim, it doesn't. We're dealing with more halachic categories. So again, just interesting point I want to make. The second point I want to make is, and this gets us into the parak itself, what's striking is that the first three mishnayot, 3 and 4 mishnayot of the parak, meaning only a third of the parak of these two prakim, chapter 1 and chapter 8 and chapter 9, which deal with basically the laws of inheritance. Only the first three mishnayot, first 3-4 mishnayot, actually discuss what we would call the standard Torah law of Yerusha, of inheritance. And specifically, it's interesting that the mishnayot, use the terminology, I mentioned this in passing, nochalin umanchilim. V'yesh nochalim v'ein manchilim. Seder nachalot kachu. Benot slav chad, natlu shlosha chalakim banachala. Echad habein v'echad habat benachala. Everything here is the terminology of nachala, nachala, nachala. However, the rest of the parak is basically what I call in Hebrew akifata Yerusha, which basically means how do you get around the biblical laws of Yerusha? So the rest of the parak is basically what are the both halachic takanot that Chazal made, as well as things which are already inherent in the halachic system that basically short circuit everything that we learn in the first three mishnayot. which I think is fascinating. The rest of the parak, and also chapter 9, is really, in many, many ways, a subversive of the laws of Yerusha. Halacha and Chazal basically wanted to make sure that the laws of Yerusha, as much as they're in the Torah, are not the final word on anything when it comes to actually transferring property and other things. And it may, again, depending on how historicity, or whatever the term is, how historicist you want to be when you read rabbinic texts. As I mentioned, I think in passing last week, the terminology of nachala is very focused on land that you pass on from one generation to another generation, right? Benot Slavchad, they talk about how we don't want the nachala of our father on his name to be lost. Later on, the Shvatim are worried that the nachala, that the portion of land is going to leave the shevet, the tribe, if the daughters of Tzlavchad marry someone outside of the shevet. So the Yerusha is the Nachala is very much focused on maintaining what we would call Nachalat Avot, maintaining this kind of very structured sense of, passing on from one generation to another generation, where people are living on the land and people are not living as much in cities. They're living in agrarian societies where they're living on the land, and that's what we are talking about. And primarily what's being passed on is land. You're not passing on your great-grandfather's Kiddush cup. You're not passing on art. You're not passing on those things. We'll see halachically that those are included halachically in Yerusha. We'll see that in a second. But I want to show you that, even though it's not explicit in our mishnayot. But the idea in the first three mishnayot is very much about passing on the nachala. And therefore, the son, who comes in place of the father in a patriarchal society, is going to inherit and not the daughters, because the son is the head of the family. The son is the head of the nachala. And so that's very, very central. One could theoretically say that as the Jewish people and as history went on, and nachala was not anymore as much a central part, the whole notion of the Shvatim disappeared with various, who knows exactly when it disappeared, but certainly with exile and the return to the land of Israel in the Second Temple, the notion of Shvatim, of tribes, kind of dissipates. And so that becomes much less of a factor. The idea of living in cities, and you're working fields, but they're much more about fields being worked outside of cities and things like that. And it's not about, oh, my nachala, your nachala. And you're passing on houses, you're passing on this, you're passing on metaltalin, you're passing on movables. So then the terminology is different. Yerusha is maybe the term that's used, but also just the conception may start to, and maybe that's why Chazal start to emphasize and many more ways of passing on both land and movables to the next generation, where the idea of the son taking the role of the father in the nachala becomes much more attenuated and much smaller. So I think that's an important thing to think about as we go through Perek Chet and Perek Tet. I mentioned in passing that in halachic terms, Yerusha, even though it doesn't say it explicitly in these mishnayot, but the concept of Yerusha is implied in a couple of sources in Shas, that it applies as well to movables. again, I'm just raising a possibility that in the time of the Torah, you never find a discussion about passing on movables. All you find is the passing on of nachala. Maybe in Din HaTorah, there was no such concept of passing on your great-grandfather's Kiddush cup, or your grandfather's tefillin, or your great-grandmother's, tichel, or whatever. It just didn't exist. By the time of Chazal, and certainly in the Gemara, you find that does exist. So, for example, here's two sources. The Gemara in Ketubot says, Yativ Rav Yosef kamed Rav Himnuna v'yativ Rav Himnuna v'ka'amar. Kishem she'ein habanim yorshim ela min hakarka, kach ein habanot nizonot ela min hakarka. So just like, this is what Rav Yosef wanted to say at first blush, that maybe just as the sons only inherit from land, so too, maybe the banot, the daughters, will only be provided their sustenance, we'll talk about what that means in halachic terms, from the produce of the land. But if the father has a stock account or has money in the bank, that's untouchable. Avshe alei kule alma, the whole world screamed at him. The shavek ara hu diyarti le b'nei. So only someone who is a landholder, if he leaves his son, that he inherits. The lo shavik ara lo yarti le b'nei. Someone who doesn't have any land does not inherit. His sons don't inherit anything. That's impossible. So there were those who wanted to, so to speak, maintain what I believe was kind of the original halacha. The original halacha was that Yerusha is only by nachalot, by land, and everybody attacks and says, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. If you can inherit land, you can inherit everything else as well. And another Gemara in Bava Basra, Tana Rabbanan, HaBechor notel, Pishnaim, Bizroa, Ubelchayim, Ubakeva, Ubemukdashim. So if the father was a Kohen, and the Kohen receives certain gifts from meat, it was a time when any meat that was brought, that was, he was given. So the Gemara says that he also receives the Bechor of the father. If he dies, he receives a double portion. Then another example. Ubashevach sheshvacho nechasim lachar mitat avihem, and any increase in value of the nechasim, of the assets after the father's death. Keitzad hiniach lahem avihem para muchkeret umuskeret biyad acher. The father rented out a cow. O shahaita roa ba'afer, or it was simply grazing in the, amongst the field here, and the ashes in the field. The Yoldan, it had a child. Bechor notel pishnayim. He receives pishnayim. Okay? So, and then the Gemara talks about other things, whether the Bechor is notel pishnayim or not. But the assumption is that when we're talking about a para, we're talking about animals, we're talking about foodstuffs, we're talking about all these things that you pass on to your son as well. So there's Yerusha of things as well. Again, in the Torah, we don't have any mention of that. In the original halachot, in the original mishnayot, it's all about nachala. It's only as we move on to the perek that you start to use the terminology of Yerusha. And at that point, it's very much about, to me, it's fascinating that at this point, most of the mishnayot are about getting around the strict laws of Yerusha. And maybe, just to throw out a possibility, once we weren't just talking about Nachala, but we were talking about a broader category, maybe the rabbis also felt more entitled to say, well, since we're not really talking about the biblical conception of Yerusha, there's more as they say in Hebrew, gmishut. There's more flexibility to be able to change the calculus. Okay, so let's start with these mishnayot here, which we started last week. But again, I want to show you it's all about what we would call akifat ha-Yerusha, trying to get around the laws of Yerusha. So it starts with ha'omer ish ploni b'ni b'chor lo yitel pichnayim. So if a father wants to do a direct confrontation with Torah law, ha'omer pi ish ploni b'ni b'chor, this is my b'chor, but I don't want him to receive the double portion, even though the Torah says the b'chor, the firstborn receives double portion. Or ish ploni b'ni, or he identifies, this is my son, lo yirash im echav. He should not get any, I'm mad at him. I don't want him to inherit with my sons. Lo amar klum, shehitni al mashakasav b'Torah. So that does not have any efficacy because you are directly confronting what the Torah says. And the Torah says you can't do that. The Torah has laws. You're directly confronting the Torah. And it's impossible, even though it's a monetary issue, it's not a Yoredeya issue. It's not a question of Isser v'heter. It's not a question of permitted and forbidden. It's not a question of kashrut or tumah, but it's a question of mammonis. So you might think when you're dealing with monetary realm, where there's a lot more give in the halachic system. For example, the Beit Din is allowed to, take money away from someone and give it to somebody else. The rabbis can make all kinds of takanot when it comes to money issues. Still, here you're directly confronting the biblical. That doesn't work. However, hamichalek nechasav lebanav al piv. But what happens if you don't use the language of Yerusha? It is very formalistic. You say, again, ostensibly during your lifetime, and the question is, what are you doing? Are you saying, I want to divide it now? Hamechalek nechasav lebanav al piv. You say, I want to give my assets to my sons. Riba le'echad u'miet le'echad v'hishvi lahem et habachor, and you increased the amount to one son over another son, or you made them equivalent to the Bechor, Devarav Kayamim. Again, unclear in the Mishnah, is this happening, and he's saying that I want this to take effect now, 2 minutes before I die, or after I die? Unclear. But if he uses that language, it works. V'im amar mishum Yerusha lo amar klum. So the key is very formalistic. What did you say? Are you trying to go on the track of Yerusha and then you have to go with the Torah's laws? Or you want to kind of get around it and say it's a matana. It's not Yerusha, it's a gift. And I can gift to whomever I want with whatever stipulations I want. And then, of course, the rest of the Mishnah is talking about different scenarios. Katav bein betchila, bein beemtza, bein besof, mishum matana. If you didn't say it, but now you wrote it, and anywhere in the document you wrote a matana, this is a gift, dvarav kayamim, because you explicitly said it's matana, it's not Yerusha. Ha'omer ish ploni yirasheni. But if you said, I want X person, I want my best friend Tommy to inherit my goods, my land. B'makom sheyesh bat, biti tirasheni b'makom sheyesh ban lo amar klum. Shehisna mashkas b'tor. It's all formalistic. You use the word matana. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, he has a radical shita. Im amar al mishu ro liyorsho dvarim kayamim. He says that even in the laws of Yerusha, there is some flexibility. If you say, I want to give it to the girl rather than the boy, since the girl, there are times when the girl is ra'ui to become a yoreshet, so she, in this case, would get it. Or if you want to give all the children equally and not give the bechor, it works. We don't paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Hakotev et nechasav la'achirim. Again, this time if you didn't use the word yirasheni, but you separated, you wrote, the rabbis don't like that. There should be some zecher. You shouldn't write everything to others. The rabbis don't like it. But if he did it, if his children were not worthy, he's actually doing a good thing. It shouldn't be an automatic thing if he writes them out of it. So again, this Mishnah is basically about how do we get around Yerusha. And here, this is talking about the person is of good health. It's not anything. It's a straightforward, you can say, you can write when you're alive, ostensibly because you're doing it at the time. You did matana. You're saying, I want to give this as a matana. Okay. Because in passing, it was mentioned here, it started with Ha'omer ish ploni b'ni b'chor lo yitol pi shnayim. Because it started with that as the opening line, the Mishnah throws in a line about, because he says, ish ploni b'ni b'chor. He's the one who's identifying that this child is a b'chor. That struck, a chord. What do you mean? Why doesn't he just say, Ha'omer b'ni b'chor lo yitol? What is it, ish ploni? So the rabbis understood that there's some ambiguity whether this child is actually a b'chor. And so once you have that, the rabbis decide to talk about other cases when there's ambiguity. Ha'omer ze b'ni ne'eman. If a person says, this is my son, even though not everybody in the city didn't know that he had another son from another woman, who knows? He's believed. Ze achi, but if he says, this is my brother, eino ne'eman, v'notel imo b'chelko. But if he says, this is my brother, the other brothers don't have to believe him. And the only thing is, if he inherits from his father, this person gets a portion of his chelek, of the man who said that this is my brother. But the other brothers don't have to accept it. Mate, yachzeru nechasim limkomam, naflu nechasim yirshu echav imo. Okay. We now switch. Once this little, speed bump on the road, we go back to discussing issues of basically how do we avoid or halachic end-arounds around Yerusha, or things which kind of parallel Yerusha that in effect supplement Yerusha, and in certain instances basically neutralize Yerusha. Because of course, the major problem with some of the laws of Yerusha is that some people can end up very destitute, especially the girls. If there are boys, the halacha is very clear that the boys inherit and the girls don't get a portion. So at that point, what happens to the girls? So that's going to be a major issue. Again, how do we live with the biblical laws of Yerusha, or how do we get around and make them livable in real society? So another case, mishamate, somebody who died, v'nimtzei daitaki keshur al yirecho. And they found a daitaki. What's a daitaki? So if you look in your Greek dictionary, daitaki, diatheki. So what is it? Oh, so I forgot. I didn't put, so a diatheki is basically a contract. But specifically, it was used in the context of what we would call a will. A contract that's written at the time of somebody's death. Very common in Greece and other places in the ancient Near East. So in that context, what happens if somebody died? Ostensibly, this is a soldier who may have written a will to be found, but he didn't give it to anybody. Nimtzei daitaki keshur al yirecho. It's connected. Harei ze eino klum. Because maybe he didn't fully finish. He might have changed his mind before he was shot, before he was able to put the final details. Maybe he wanted to change percentages. Happens all the time. However, Zika Bala'acher, he gave this document to somebody else. Bein minayorshim, bein sheino minayorshim, dvarav kayamim. Whether they're an interested party or they're not an interested party, then it works. So here we have another. Okay, here we have kotev mechalek nechasav lebanav alpiv. Hakotev et nechasav la'acherim. So here it's about giving to your children, and you mess up the order of Yerusha. Here it's about giving to others, but ostensibly you're alive, and you separate it during your lifetime. It works. Here somebody's dead, but they wrote their intentions, so it sounds like it works. How does it work? So it sounds like somebody who's about to die or thinks they're going to die, there's some sort of special status that seems to emerge from a person's, kind of last will and testament. It's almost like in, American law that there's a person's, if a person's dying, their last words have a certain status in law beyond hearsay. Usually, if you hear from another person, it's called hearsay. But if it was a deathbed confession or something like that, it has greater status in law. Here too, this person wrote the daitiki and he gave it to somebody before he died. Maybe he was very terminally ill. Then it works. We give a status again here. And here, maybe this is even more than here. Here, maybe he has to do a kinyan, just to throw out a possibility. Here, when he divides his assets, maybe he has to use the normal paths of transferring assets, or he has to give the shtar with a kinyan. Maybe here, zika bala'acher implies some other derech, some other way. Now we have another case. Hakotev nechasav lebanav. Okay, somebody writes he knows maybe, and this time he's writing. So you could say that this is explaining back this Mishnah, or again, as I said, maybe this Mishnah is talking about when the person is alive and going to live another 20 years, and he's simply doing it right now, and it has validity right now. But what happens if a person wants to pass it on after his death, and he wants it to have validity? Remember, if you're dead, you have no status. You can't write a shtar that's chal when you're dead. You have to be alive. But on the other hand, you want to do it right before you die, and you want to, on the other hand, maintain some control. Maybe in this case, the moment you're machalik nechasav lebanav, they're there, they're his. Everything, the karka, the land, the produce, whatever is produced on the land, it's fully his. Okay? And this is talking about kind of a total matana. Here, we're talking about a new category. Hakotev, I called it a tzava, will, halachic will. Hakotev nechasav levanav, tzarich sheyichtov mehayom la'achar mita. Here, we're talking about something else. We're talking about someone who wants to transfer ownership of his property and his assets to his children, but he still wants to be able to benefit from the thing, the produce. But he wants, in the end, when he dies, the thing, the asset, to be fully in the control of his children. So hakotev nechasav lebanav tzarich shichtov mehayom ul'achar mita, from today and after death, which is interpreted by the halacha as retroactively, the children are going to get control of whatever retroactively, they're going to get control of what happened. But right now, the father still maintains the rights to live on the land and enjoy the produce. Rabbi Yossi Omer Eino Tzarech. Rabbi Yossi says you don't even have to go that far. You could just do it with intention that you're holding on. That's very radical, but you can do that. Hakotev nechasav libno la'achar moto. If you do this, however, ha'av eno yachol limkor. The father now has no rights to sell the property, mipnei sheku ktuvim lebein, because they've been written that they will be controlled retroactively from this moment by the child. The child can't sell. You can't sell something that is not under your control. Since according to this halacha, the father still is able, he has the control of the land, and he's the one who gets the payroll, he gets the produce, you can't sell it. Okay. And therefore, that's the halacha. Mechurin machar ha'av, if the father did sell it, mechurin ad shiyamus. It only has validity until he dies. Machar habein ein la lokech bem klum ad shiyamus ha'av. And if the son sold it, the lokeach, the customer who bought it, doesn't have anything until the father dies, because it's not in the control of the son to sell. The minute the father dies, retroactively, the son now controls it, and therefore, that's when the sale takes effect. If the father, however, takes out the fruit and harvests the fruit, he could sell it because now it's not anymore the land. Whatever is on the ground is now a separate asset, and it is those who inherit. Another issue that becomes very central, as I said, in how do we find a way around the laws of Yerusha is, of course, the famous question of how do you sustain the daughters? How do you sustain the daughters when the assets are all going to the sons? So the Gemara in Ketubot and these mishnayot really are, these mishnayot are really, Ketubot mishnayot. These mishnayot basically are discussing, these mishnayot and certainly the next mishnayot are going to be discussing what we call mizonot. Mizonot are, as anyone who's ever listened carefully to the ketubah at a wedding, one of the what's called tna'ei ha-ketubah, one of the conditions in the ketubah is that the husband obligates himself based on the takana of Chazal. Chazal wanted to protect the woman and the woman's daughters, that they would be provided for until they get married. They would be provided for from the estate. And that's what it says in the ketubah, that the almana, the widow, as well as the daughters, will be provided for from the estate. Now, the last two mishnayot are talking about an estate before it has been divided. And I want to just go one step further. It's not just one step. There's a concept in halacha called meshek habayit, which means sometimes the family chose not to divide. They had a family ranch, they had a family farm, and they wanted to continue. And it was a kind of shutafut. It was a kind of partnership where everybody is working together to ensure that the family farm continues to produce and continues to sustain the entire family as a corporate unit. So this is what these mishnayot are talking about. And since you're not dealing with Yerusha, you're dealing with people being sustained from the land. Now, what do you do with young children who can't work? And, what's their status? What's their role in the meshek, in the family? What exactly, and what are they entitled to? So in this context, the mishnayot say, "Hiniach banim gdolim uktanim, ena gdolim mitparnesim al aktanim, velo aktanim nizonin al hagdolim, ela cholkim b'shaveh." Lehitparnes means to buy clothing. Nizonin in this context refers to getting provided sustenance, food and water, and that kind of stuff. So everybody has to take an equal amount. We don't privilege the Gedolim over the Ketanim. When it comes to paying for weddings, Nasu HaGdolim, Yisu HaKtanim. When the Gedolim get married and they take to pay for the wedding expenses from the Meshek HaBayit, from the family farm, the Ketanim can do the same thing. V'im amru Ketanim harei anu nosim kederach shenasatem atem. However, if the Ketanim say, after the father's death, we want to get as much, Abba spent $400,000 on your wedding, we want also to spend, ain't shomin lehem, elamasha natan lehem aviem natan. No, you don't listen to them. What the father gave the Gedolim, he gave not as a Yerusha, he gave it as whatever he decided to give them. And so, here too, now you get a certain amount, but you can't demand what they got when it wasn't in terms of being sustained, from the estate after the father died. Hiniach. What they got when the father was alive was the father choosing to give them this or that. And the same thing with banot. Hiniach banot gdolot uktanot. He only left girls. Eina gdolot mit parnesot aktanot ulaktanot nizanot alakdolot cholkot b'shaveh. Nasu gdolot yisu ktanot. V'imamru ktanot harayanu nosot k'derech shnata. Ein shom lehem. You don't listen to them? Okay. Now we come to the Tractates, which continues discussing the laws of Yerusha. And again, now we're fully involved in the laws of, fully involved in the laws of mizonot, as opposed to, the assets. The assets we want to maintain because they haven't divided the assets yet. And there's a chiyuv, there's an obligation, there's a chov, there's a debt. And the debt comes before the Yerusha. And it has to be paid to the daughters. So if there's a lot of assets, habanim yirshu, they can now divide the land. Vabanot yizonu. And the banot can get their sustenance until they get married. Since there's enough land, you set aside a portion of the land to provide for the daughters until they get married. The assumption is that they're going to be able to get a portion of land to work, and they'll be able to sell the fruit or use the fruit, etc. And that's enough. However, if there's not a lot of assets, habanot yizonu, vabanim yishalu laptachim. If there's not a lot of assets, the girls come first. The sense is that there's a chov, there's a debt that comes before anything else that has to be paid off before Yerusha. Habanot yizonu. It's a striking thing. Vabanim yishalu aptachim. Now, of course, the boys can go to work if they want. The Mishnah is just making kind of hyperbole. Even if the boys have to go and collect tzedakah, that's what they should do. Admon omer, Bishvil sha'ani zachar hifsadeti. Because I'm a man, I should lose? Admon makes sense. But that's not the way we paskin. Halacha l'maisa. The obligation, the chovot, come before Yerusha. Before you can split, you first have to pay off the father's obligations. Could be obligations to others, but also the tna'ei ketubah, the conditions of the ketubah are considered a shibud, they're considered a lien on the estate of the father, and they come first. The next Mishnah, of course, is one of those interesting mishnayot about a tumtum. A tumtum is a man who we don't, or a woman, we don't know whether it's not a somebody who is a both male and female. That's an androgynous. This is someone who we know is either a male or a female, but we don't know exactly what they are. So again, the question is, do you treat them like a boy? Do you treat them like a girl? Obviously, you can play with all these kinds of cases. And again, these are all cases of the nechasim, the chalukat nechasim, what we would call the Yerusha versus mizonot. That's what these mishnayot are all about. And here too, hiniach, again, assuming that they haven't yet divided the whatchamacallit, the meshek, they haven't divided yet the estate. Hiniach banim gdolim uktanim, hishbichu gdolim et hanechasim, hishbichu la'emtza. If they improved in some way the value, they installed something, they raised the value of the land, since it is part, they haven't yet divided the land, whatever increase in value is split equally amongst the children. And then when you divide the land in Yerusha, everybody gets an equal portion. Imamru re'u ma shiliach lanu abba, harei anu osim ve'ochlim hishbichu la'atzma. If, however, they say, look what father left us, we're gonna do and we're gonna eat, we're only gonna make this part, we're gonna improve this part, not the whole thing, then they can do it for themselves. And the same thing with a woman. Okay. And finally, before we get to the Shchiv Meirah, the laws of Shchiv Meirah, which are very striking, another way to get around the laws of Yerusha, we have here another situation, again, about responsibilities from the Meshek HaBayit, responsibilities before Yerusha. So we talked about mizonot. How do you pay off people who are the children or others, the women, the young women who have to be provided for, the girls? That comes before Yerusha. So Yerusha is neutralized again until that is taken care of. Here's another issue. What happens if, again, discussing when they're all working together? One of them decides to become a doctor. Nafal le'emtza. Whatever income, it's like a kibbutz. Whatever income he earns has to be shared because he is part of the Meshek HaBayit. As long as he's still living on the estate and he's participating in the estate, okay? Chalav nitrapeh mishal atzmo. Hachim shasu miksatam shushvinut b'chayav. This is a fascinating phenomenon, shushvinut, what we would call groomsmen, but basically it was a transactional thing. If your friends got married, you sent them lots of gifts and food. So ha'achim shasu miksatam shushvinut b'chayav during the time of the father. Chazra shushvinut chazra le'emtza. When they send back, when one of the brothers gets married, when they send back the same thing, then you divide it equally amongst all the brothers. Shashushvinut nikveit bebezdin, because it's an obligation, can even be collected in a court. But if you just sent a matana, eina nikvim bebezdin shem gmilus chasadim. So that's called shushvinus. The second thing is called sivlonot. Sivlonot is when you get married. So you send gifts. The chatan sends gifts, right? They do kiddushin, and the girl lives there lives in the father and mother's house for another 6 months, a year. So you send gifts. Sometimes a lot of gifts, sometimes a little bit of gifts. If you send a lot of gifts, the assumption is she's going to bring some of that back into the home, and that's part of the dowry that's going to be written in the ksuba. She's also going to bring a dowry herself. So hasholech sivlonot lebeit chamav shalach sham mea man v'achal sham suda chatan afilu b'dinar einon nigvim, can't collect them. Lo achal shu. If you didn't, then you can collect it back. Okay, so these are all, as I said, examples, just like here. These are all examples of issues, things that are collected and spent on before Yerusha. Either they go around the Yerusha, they neutralize Yerusha, or they come before Yerusha. We now come back to the final case of how you can, so to speak, get around Yerusha. And that's the concept of a shchiv meira, someone literally on their deathbed. Not someone who thinks, who says, oh, when I die, this and this, but somebody literally on their deathbed. But it turns out he has a miraculous recovery. So shchiv meira, somebody who is literally on his deathbed. Shekatav kol nechasav lacherim v'shiur karka kolshu. But he left a little bit. Matanato kayemet. Then, even if he comes back, and even if he, at the last moment, is able to rally and he recovers, what he did counts. Because since he left a little bit of karka, and therefore there was still something to do Yerusha from. And he intended that if he came back, he would do some Yerusha, but what he gave is kayam. Lo shiur karka kolshu, ein matnato kayemet. But if he didn't leave anything, then it shows that he really, did not intend. He really believed he was going to die. And if he came back, he would have never done this in any way, shape, or form, and therefore he never intended to sell it if he came back. Lo katav b'shchiv meira. And if he didn't write it, hu omer shchiv meira haya, and he says, I was really sick. V'hein omrim bari haya. And the sons say, no, he was healthy. Tzarich lavi raya sheyashchiv meira divrei Meir v'chachamim hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. No, since the father gave to whoever he wanted, that is his, and now it's in the possession of others. If you want to take that away, you need a proof. And finally, it goes back to what we started with in the very first kind of closing of a circle. It goes back to mechalek nechasav. If you want to separate when you're alive, exactly how do you do it? So in the different categories of halacha, different categories, nechasim sheish lem achrayot. Nechasim meaning property, niknim b'kesep, b'shtar b'chazaka. V'shein lem achrayot. Movables, a niknim el b'meshicha. You have to move the things. Okay, so this is basically the end. And finally, at the very end of this, once we've been talking about all these things, we kind of close the circle. We come back. At the beginning, we defined exactly who is the Yorshim, and that some Yorshim, they both inherit, and if they die, their stuff goes to a generation beforehand. So if the son dies and there's no brothers, it goes back to the father. And this was the Seder HaNachalot. Okay, Ben kodem lebat, etc., etc. Achim kodmin la'achei ha'av. All these are the cases of exactly, and through this we know who is defined as a Yorish. We kind of close the circle with cases to decide, not in terms of who is the Yoresh in the sense of, is a father a Yoresh, is a brother a Yoresh, is a sister a Yoresh, but cases where it's unclear who died first, and therefore who actually was Yoresh who. So in a certain sense, it's closing a circle right? Yesh nochlin umanchilin, yesh nochlin umanchilin. Elu nochalim umanchilin. Ha'av et habanim. The father inherits the sons. If the sons die, the father, and there's no other brothers, the father inherits the sons. V'abanim et ha'av. The sons inherit the father, etc., etc. And then there are cases where it only goes in one direction. And here, it ends with 3 cases of nafal habayit alav. If a house collapsed. And here, again, you see the pattern. Nafal habayit alav al aviv, or alav al morishav. So the house fell on him and his father, or on him and other people who can inherit. V'haita alav ktubat isha uba'al chov. And basically, there was an obligation to pay the daughter, to pay the father. There was a ksuba. There's a ksuba, or there was an outstanding debt to the son. The son had an outstanding debt. So it's very interesting. Yorshei ha'av omrim habein meit rishon. The son died first. V'achar kach meit ha'av. Balei hachov omrim ha'av meit rishon. V'achar kach meit habein. So basically, the question is, did the obligation that was on the father, did it come down onto the son or not? Who died first? And these are all the same cases in terms of that. Okay. The final, in 5 minutes, the final perek. Once we talked about all these categories of kotev, writing documents. Rabbi decided to put in the very end of Bava Batra the laws of shtar, the laws of halachic documents. And what's interesting is that at one time, the term shtar was interchangeable with the term get. Today, we use the term get to refer to a divorce document. But if you look in the original sources, the word get was also used for a document to free a slave, a document to sell something. And so originally, it was all about get, and that was the terminology that was used, get. At a certain point, after this one, okay, after Mishnah 3, the rest of the perek only uses the term shtar. At some point, the terminology of get became totally identified with a divorce document, and the term shtar, contract, became identified with the rest of documents. And so this first Mishnah, which talks about 2 types of get, a get pashut and a get mekushar, you read, I'm sure you learned about, right? There used to be an open document where you didn't have nothing was hidden, nothing was closed, nothing was tied together, and others that was tied together. The Gemara says the reason why some documents were written that way was so that the Kohanim, when they gave a get, they would think twice before giving a get to their wife. A Kohen is not allowed to remarry his wife who he divorced, because once she's divorced, and a Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman. A regular Jew can remarry his divorced wife unless she remarries someone else, halachically. And then gets divorced again, he can't marry her. So that's the idea. And it tells you all the details of this. The second part, the second Mishnah, of course, talks about which nusach should we trust. The first lines of the shtar or the last lines of the shtar. We always follow, the end. We always follow the end, or the most minimum amount that you are obligating yourself if it's contradictory. Okay? And then we have all kinds of laws about consent. When do you write a shtar? Under what circumstances do you write a shtar? And then, of course, the rest of the perek deals with the most common types of shtarot, the most common types of documents, which are shtarei chov, which are obligation, which we would call, I have an obligation. I lent someone something, or I owe someone something. So therefore, the recurring word in all these mishnayot are chov, shtar chov, shtar chov, shtar chov, shtar chov, shtar chov. And of course, and it ends with the classic laws related to milveh b'shtar. If I lend money with a shtar, what can I collect from? Can I collect from only real property, or I can collect from metaltalin? All these are the laws halachically, etc., etc. And of course, it ends with a beautiful little statement, Amar Rabbi Shmuel Harotza Shiachkim, which is what we started with 5 weeks ago. Ya'asok b'dinei mamonis. If you want to be smart, you should study the laws of mamonot. She'ein lecha mikzoa b'Torah gadol mehem. There is no more large area of Torah. There's no more difficult area. She'ein kimayan hanovea. These are like a spring that continues to spring forth. If you really want to study it, you should become a shamus. You should study carefully and serve Shimon ben Nanas, who was mentioned earlier in the Mishnah. Okay, with that, we finish our study of Bava Batra. I wish you well on your study of Sanhedrin. I think Sanhedrin is an easier Masechta to learn, less complicated, more familiar things. And I wish you tremendous enjoyment in the world of Sanhedrin. All the best, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Helfgot, and thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you again, Rabbi Helfgot. Really great learning with you. And I'll see you soon.